Welcome to episode 2 of the Retro Baseball Game Challenge, where I'll be playing every old baseball game I can get my hands on. And in today's episode, we'll be playing Major League Baseball featuring Ken Griffey Jr., the first 3D baseball game published by Nintendo, and the direct sequel to some very popular games on the NES and Super Nintendo. I have some very faint memories of playing this game. I never owned it as a kid, but maybe I rented it or played it at a neighbor's house. I'm not sure, but I'm excited to see how it plays and if it holds up in 2023. Like I mentioned at the end of the last episode, I'm a bit worried with how these old 3D games might hold up, so let's check it out.
Hi, this is Ken Griffey Jr. Let's play Major League Baseball.
Before we get started, just note that we'll be playing on original N64 hardware with an HDMI converter to help with recording. I wanted to capture footage straight from the N64 original composite cables, but my TV doesn't recognize the import when it passes through the game capture software, so we'll have to play it with the converter, which makes the game look a bit better, but also kind of awkwardly stretches the pictures, so just keep that in mind. Right out the gate here with Ken Griffey Jr., the presentation here for an N64 title is really sleek, and we are treated to an intro song, which I was not expecting for an old baseball game from this era. Just listen to how catchy this is.
Call me Junior. Call me Junior. Call me Junior.
Can anyone remember if any other baseball game had its own song quite like this? I guess we'll find out as we play more and more old games, but I would say this is the DK rap equivalent to the baseball video game universe, and hopefully I'm not jumping the gun by saying that. After jamming out for a bit, we get to the main menu, which is kind of fancy for an N64 game. There is a spinning baseball that gives us 4 main game modes: Exhibition, Season, World Series, and Home Run Derby. We'll be playing all of these for the sake of this video, but let's jump into a regular exhibition game to get my first impressions. I decided to play at Camden Yards for my first game, which is surprisingly one of the few stadiums still standing today in this game. Scrolling through all the home ballparks, only 12 still exist, which means 18 teams have had demolished or new stadiums since 1997 when this game came out. Probably what makes baseball so unique is how each stadium plays a little bit differently, and I never really thought about it until now, but getting to play some of these older ballparks in these games is going to be quite fun, considering many don't exist in newer games like The Show. I also have a lifetime goal of getting to every ballpark. I'm about halfway there now, so getting to see some of them, even in their janky N64-bit form that don't exist anymore, will be at least kind of interesting to me. When the game starts, we are treated to a full rendition of the national anthem, which I'll play for you now in its entirety.
Good evening and welcome to Oriole Park at Camden Yards.
Just kidding, but it's neat to have an intro considering many games before the N64 era don't really have anything. Even little steps like this help to form modern baseball games. At the start of the game, we are quickly greeted by a cursor when hitting that you must pretty obviously line up with the pitch. The size of the cursor changes depending on how good of a hitter is. Basically, the result of your hit will correspond with how accurate you line up your bat. A box pops up when the pitcher starts his delivery that shows you where a pitch begins, but it's up to you to line up your cursor with where it ends up, while also getting the timing just right. Mechanically, it's kind of similar to contact hitting in the Super Mega Baseball series, if any of you have played that, which I will play at some point later on in this series. Speaking of which, I do like that there is no special button for contact or power hitting. The game is all about the physics of how well your bat marker lines up with the pitch, so it creates a very satisfying feeling when batting. Unlike the hitting mechanics in the previous episode, The Bigs 2, you get a sense that the game is correctly calculating your skills with pretty decently realistic physics. Honestly, the only thing hitting-wise that felt a little unrealistic was the game allows a few too many singles through the infield, Like in my first dozen or so games, I would end up with like 16 hits but only 3 or 4 runs, which makes for an odd looking box score, but your miles will vary depending on what difficulty you play on. Outside of that though, the hitting feels solid, way more than I ever thought it would. I should note that you can also turn on classic hitting mode if you don't like this new system, which reverts back to the Super NES versions of the game for a more simplified approach.
Batting fifth, the left fielder, David Justice.
Pitching-wise, you're able to select from 4 different pitches, which changes depending on what type of pitcher you are. You either press the A or B button, or Z plus A or Z plus B corresponding to the pitch you want to throw. Even Tim Wakefield is in here with an absolutely cheesy knuckleball that works so well against the computer players, I had to ban myself from using it. Anyways, you essentially aim the pitch with a blinking cursor that is supposed to mimic your pitcher's heartbeat. The more tired a pitcher is, the longer the ball cursor stays on screen, and in theory makes it easier to hit. After selecting the location, you can then move your cursor as the pitcher is winding up to move the ball marker and try to trick the batter or throw their timing off. Like I mentioned earlier, the batter will kind of know where your pitch begins, but it's up to you where it ends up. If you move your cursor in the direction a pitch is supposed to move, you can really make it dive. Like if you move a curveball down in the zone during the windup, it can move like the entire strike zone versus just a smidge if you try to move it in the opposite direction from its natural movement, like upwards. Earlier I mentioned that everyone has 4 pitches, which is true, but some of them are very arcadey. There's even something called super changeups that dip into like the mid-40s. Whenever this happens, it reminds me that this is an arcade experience to a certain extent. I also want to note that when pitching, I pretty much immediately gave up a 550-foot home run to the computer, which is just absurd, and also when I began to realize that this isn't a perfect baseball sim and more of an arcade-style hybrid that tries to be more fun to play than a simulation approach.
That ball's going, gone.
Home run!
My only big negative with pitching is how stamina works against the computer. When a pitcher gets tired, the game introduces progressively longer and longer animations like a pitcher bending over and shaking his head, which is a nice visual touch but really takes away from how snappy the game plays otherwise. Like I wouldn't mind it every now and then, but between every pitch, it's exhausting to watch and only remedying when the computer puts in a reliever, which they usually do, but sometimes they really let them stand out there forever, and it makes the game drag a bit more than it normally does. Outside of the basic gameplay, the game takes a huge control jump with base running and fielding that is mostly controlled using the C-stick buttons on the N64 controller and works perfectly. That being said, if any other N64 game doesn't use these buttons for selecting bases, I'll be stunned. What I most liked about fielding was how responsive the overall player movement was. They move a touch slow but significantly faster than in previous generations, and dives and jumps are satisfying to complete. The only negative fielding-wise for me is that the game would occasionally select the wrong fielder. For example, if there's a ball hit between the pitcher and, say, the shortstop, naturally the shortstop would come in to collect it before throwing to first. In this game, though, there's a pretty good chance the game may auto-select the pitcher, so when you're holding down the control stick when reading the ball, only for your pitcher to be running the wrong way and easily give up an infield single that should have been an out. You basically have to train your eyes to see which player you are controlling first before making a movement to field a ball. This can also take away from how snappy and responsive the game is otherwise.
Out! And the winners are the Tampa Bay Devil Rays.
So yeah, those are my initial thoughts on the gameplay basics, and I'll grade that out at the end of this video, but I also thought it'd be fun to try out the Home Run Derby for a bit, which really is a game mode that should be mandatory in every baseball game. Kids growing up absolutely love the Home Run Derby, and being able to play a video game version of it is almost essential for any game from the N64 generation and beyond. Kudos to the developers for including it here. The game is straightforward, and hitting is similar to the exhibition mode, except it does skew more towards home runs. You get 10 outs to hit as many as possible. Nothing fancy about this game mode, but I did want to point it out, and it would have been an absolute blast to play as a kid against anyone else.
Home run!
Moving on to the bulk of where I'll be spending my time with this game, and that's the season mode. You have the option to do a full fantasy draft, so I thought that would be a good idea. The only issue is there is almost no information when selecting players for the draft, and I like baseball, but asking me to remember who the best players to build a team around from the 1997 season is impossible. I actually had to look up the league leaders from that year on Baseball Reference just to help form my team, although I did find out later you can slowly look at player stats by pressing Z. We also know from playing a few exhibition games that better players have a larger swing zone, so we do want to make sure we were building a competitive roster versus just players I kind of remember. When looking up all these stats, I could not believe that 35 different players in 97 had a batting average of 300 or better. Compare that to only 9 players with a 300 average in the 2023 season at the time of recording this. It's just crazy to think how baseball's changed that dramatically over the last 20 or so years. Even though this is a fantasy draft, I went with the Tampa Bay Devil Rays since that just screams 90s to me. The back of the game even advertising getting to play as these 2 new expansion teams as a feature, so why not? My first 3 draft picks for the squad were Brady Anderson, Jim Thome, and Bobby Bonilla. These old school players really take me back, so I also drafted Tim Wakefield, Royce Clayton, Joe Girardi, and even Jose Canseco, to name a few more.
Home run!
In season mode, you can choose from a full season or just part of one. As you play games, there is some light stat tracking, free agency, and the ability to make trades. Nothing here is too complex, but all helps to round out a solid season mode and adds plenty of replay value to the entire experience. I should mention that there is also a 4th mode, a World Series mode, which basically allows you to skip everything and go straight to a best of 7 series with whoever you want. Unfortunately, outside of a couple graphics, the presentation doesn't change all that much until you win the World Series, so I found its inclusion to be a bit lackluster. Speaking of presentation though, there are some neat tricks the game pulls off. I enjoy the swooping camera angles the game will use from time to time. For example, the camera switches to a behind the fielder view for some pop-ups, which is a really neat touch. I also like how when throwing to bases, the camera moves straight to the base, which makes a good throw seem way extra dramatic. Graphically, the game is what it is, and it takes a moment for your eyes to adjust to the blockiness, but nothing that prevents you from accurately reading a ball or a pitch, so I have no real complaints there either.
Batting third, the center fielder, Ken Griffey Jr.
Alright, so on to our grades. Hitting was easily my favorite part of the entire game. Mechanically, it has really realistic physics, well beyond what I was expecting for a game from the mid-90s. The lining up the cursor style approach might not be everyone's favorite, and I can see why some people might not like it, but for me it works extremely well. I find it super satisfying to hit a home run in this game as I do in modern games like The Show, which I think really says something about how well the hitting mechanics are in this game. Pitching is a little more of a mixed bag. It's fine, responsive, but some of the presentation elements take the focus off the gameplay and you feel like you're staring at that strike zone a bit too much, and trying to trick the hitters by moving the pitch during the windup adds some skill versus just simply selecting a spot to pitch, but it's not the most engaging setup. Luckily, computers are extremely aggressive, so half innings can be played in like 30 seconds or less, meaning you're not dragged down at all by spending too much of your time pitching. Presentation here is also a bit of a mixed bag, but they do have some modern touches like stat tracking, background noises, and I even enjoy the little snippets of commentary from Ken Griffey Jr., as little as there are. And the camera angle tricks that I mentioned before are really cool. In terms of replay value, for a baseball game, you basically need a main game mode to keep you coming back, and that's here with season mode. I'm not sure what the first baseball game to do a fantasy draft is, but this has to be one of the earlier ones, and I would have loved that growing up. In terms of enjoyment, what this game gets right, it really gets right. It truly feels like a great video game representation of the sport, where skill and challenge are set to a nice balanced level. It's rewarding and not too overcomplicated, but most importantly, a lot of fun. To sum up my time with Major League Baseball featuring Ken Griffey Jr., the game exceeded my expectations significantly. I was expecting a competent baseball game, I guess, especially given the reputation of the previous titles on earlier consoles. But it was way more than that, and a lot of fun to play. Any worries I had about this jump to the 3D era of games was put to rest almost immediately with this one. Now, graphically, it is pretty bland, but more than acceptable given the era. I'm pretty much going to have to make this an A-tier game, as they got what matters most right, in my opinion, and that's solid baseball gameplay with plenty of depth and variety. There are some dated quality of life features missing that prevent it from making a jump to the next tier, and the presentation is lacking just a bit, but nothing that holds it back from being an excellent 90s baseball game. So we're going to go even deeper into the retro catalog with the next episode and play Super Baseball Simulator 1000, better known as the Ultra Baseball series in Japan. A game, after some quick research, seems to be held in pretty high regard for many, and just generally one of the better retro baseball experiences out there, even though I'll be honest, I've never heard of it before. I'll be putting it to the test using the Switch Online SNES service to see if it's actually any good, and will kind of give me an excuse to use that wireless SNES Switch controller that Nintendo came out with relatively recently, and I've never had an excuse to bring it out of the box. Anyways, if you like these videos, remember to subscribe to be notified for episode 3 whenever that drops. Until then, peace out.